Okay, good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the 24-hour cycle. So today we're going to start the unit on the court system. Let's start with a little history. Before there were courts, there were blood feuds. As you can imagine, most of these were pretty bloody and usually based on vengeance. When there were disputes between tribes, the issues were decided by battle between two warriors who would prove who was the best with a club and a spear. In Germanic tribes of Europe, these disputes could be settled by a payment to the victim's family in lieu of violence. This payment was called a Wehrgeld, which translates as man price. The specific price was determined by the status of the victim, peasant or nobleman. In England, the payment was called a bot. In addition to the bot, the perpetrator was required to pay a wit, which was payment to the king or nobleman for breaking the king's peace. This was an easy way for the king to raise money because the people didn't really object. The fees were gradually increased, and practice was generally institutionalized as a way of resolving conflicts more peacefully and less bloody. These early English courts did more than resolve conflicts. They were usually convened to mark some celebration, such as a royal birth or wedding or religious festival. Nobles used these occasions to meet and discuss war, taxes, and other matters of government, including the establishment of new laws. In many ways, these medieval courts were both courts and Congress. The line between civil and criminal was not yet established, and the accused had no rights. The early courts had three methods of determining guilt: compurgation, ordeal, and battle. Compurgation was the practice of pledging one's oath to free the accused. The oath of a noble whose Wehrgeld was 1,000 shillings, could be countered by 5 freemen who were each worth 200 shillings. So if a nobleman did something bad, then he'd have to have enough people swearing an oath that he was good to equal the 1,000 shillings that his life was worth. Women and slaves could not offer an oath, so someone would have to offer their oath. The accuser was required to offer more oaths than the defendant as a way to prove guilt. There were strict procedures for oath giving. The individual was required to take the oath without any mistakes, and if they did not raise their hand off the Bible, or if they neglected to kiss it afterwards, the oath was considered an act against God, and the oath was invalidated. Trial by ordeal, judicium Dei, was perhaps the most gruesome. There were several variations. This method of justice was based on the belief that if the accused was innocent, God would intervene and a miracle would occur. There were trials by fire in which the accused had to walk on hot blades or iron. Trial by water. A stone was placed in the bottom of a boiling cauldron, and the accused had to retrieve the stone. The accused would be burned, but if the burn healed in 3 days, it was considered a miracle, and the person was judged innocent. There were other types of ordeals, but I think you get the idea. Basically, the accused had to do something that couldn't be done without harm. Boy, talk about a setup, huh? The last type of determination of guilt was trial by battle. This was used by knights as well as peasants. It was a judicial duel, and whoever survived determined guilt or innocence. The next development in the court system was the development of the jury. The inquest was the first type of jury. After a war, the king would have to decide ownership of the conquered lands. Eventually, the inquest was used to determine other concerns as well, and it became the forerunner of the grand jury, where the accused would be brought before the court to determine whether or not he or she should be charged with a crime. In 1166, a law called the Assize of Clarendon was enacted to correct some of the problems and inefficiencies of the judicial process. When the prosecution was simply a matter between individuals, sometimes the accuser wouldn't show up for court. This was a problem for two reasons. One was that the guilty person would go free, but also the king could not collect the court fee. The Assize of Clarendon was a series of ordinances that established the beginnings of the grand jury. The jury consisted of 12 good men for each jurisdiction who would inform the king's judges of the most serious offenses committed in their area. Charging was taken away from the individual accuser and given to civic-minded citizens who formed the jury as a service to their community. This was, of course, the beginning of the victim being excluded from the justice system. The crimes were against the state or the king. Offenses went from private wrongs to public problems. The Assize of Clarendon eventually developed into a body that determined whether there was sufficient evidence to detain the accused before trial. Today, the grand jury serves as a check against overzealous prosecutors. The jury trial was created because the Roman Catholic Church forbade priests from participating in trials by ordeal. Since divine intervention determined innocence in the trial by ordeal, the priest had to judge whether a miracle had indeed occurred. The problem was that the priest had too many roles to play, which often created conflict of interest, so the church had to prevent priest involvement in the practice. Still, the people preferred some kind of divine intervention and miracles. They had to figure out a new system. Because of the Assize of Clarendon, the people familiar with a jury of sorts, so they decided that 12 good men would take the place of priests. At first, people were given a choice between a jury trial and being held in a dungeon indefinitely. It was if the jury convicted, then the offender's lands and properties were confiscated and given to the king. If, however, the offender died in the dungeon, the family could keep their properties. The dungeon imprisonment was called la peine forte dure. That's French, for those of you who didn't recognize my terrible accent. It meant strong and hard punishment, which entailed a diet of bread and water, heavy chains, and absolutely deplorable conditions. There was a problem with this system in that members of the jury were usually the same people who served on the grand jury that brought the original charges to court. There was little testimony because they had already heard the facts of the case. Generally, guilt or innocence was determined by the accused's reputation. Eventually, the process became so flawed that the two juries were separated with different men serving on each one. It took another 250 years before the jury became the powerful institution of the 15th century. The decision of the jury was final, making it impossible for angry judges to change the verdict. Today, the jury is the check against the power of the state to prosecute citizens. About that same time that the jury came into being, King John was pressured into signing the Magna Carta, which placed the king under the same rule of law as everyone else. It started with a group of noblemen who felt that the king had too much arbitrary power over them. The Magna Carta was the first document that began to erode the divine rights of kings. Still, this did not stop the crown from using the courts as a tool of repression. Political offenses and treasons were especially problematic. So a special judicial body, the Court of the Star Chamber, was established to deal with offenses such as riots, unlawful assembly, perjury, criminal libel, and conspiracy. The court met in the Palace of Westminster in London, in a room that had stars painting on the ceiling. Although the court's sentences included corporal punishment, convicts were never sentenced to death. The Court of the Star Chamber had its problems. Interrogation of suspects was done in secret. the use of torture as a fact-finding tool. The accused had no right to trial by jury. Accusation was brought without any evidence, and the accused was not informed of the identity of the people making the accusations. I think you can kind of see the problems here. The Court of Star Chamber was important because it demonstrated how a court without due process could violate the human rights of citizens. In addition, In addition, it showed how unfettered power could be used to subvert the law and cause innocent people to be found guilty. It was abolished in 1641. The United States Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is the remnants of that, although they obviously don't torture people. By the 18th century, partly due to the abuses of the Court of the Star Chamber, most courts in England had essential elements of modern criminal procedures, such as preliminary hearings, grand juries, the opportunity for defendant to challenge jurors, and the idea that jury's verdict is a final decision when the defendant is acquitted. Even though these procedures were in place, they were often applied in a haphazard and inconsistent manner. Sometimes defendants were allowed to have their own counsel. Juries were not of the defendant's peers, but rather upper-class, respectable citizens. In addition, the concepts of probable cause and presumption of innocence was not fully ingrained into the criminal justice process. Nevertheless, the English courts provided a foundation for the courts of early North American colonies. Colonial courts in America had problems because the colonies were founded on different premises, such as religious dissenters in Pennsylvania compared to landed gentry in Virginia who were given land by the king. Each colony had their own way of governing because England made no concerted effort to develop standardized practices among the colonies. The early governors could hold court as they pleased, and there were no legal protections for defendants. When Americans complained to England, if there was any response at all, it was to send a military judge to the colonies. The early adoption of slavery in the colonies caused problems for the justice system, so an alternative system of laws was created to control slaves. These courts were an abomination. The landowner was usually the law and the judge, so you can imagine how much justice there was. In spite of the mismatch of legal institutions, progress had begun. Many individuals deemed the New World a fresh start. These men were greatly influenced by the works of philosophers such as John Locke and Immanuel Kant, whose writings inspired the Enlightenment movement in Europe with its principles of liberty, limited government, and equality. One of the primary social forces that led to the American Revolution was the colonists' belief that the English crown was treating them unfairly. Houses were searched to find untaxed items that were smuggled into the colonies. Trial by jury, right to counsel, and grand jury indictments were unheard of in the colonies. Because many of the colonists were second-class citizens in England, the Crown felt no obligation to give them any consideration. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights were all written in an atmosphere of anti-government sentiment. And this will continue on the next slide.